Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. The political fallout from Iran's leadership transition is continuing to unfold as funeral ceremonies continue for former Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Anti-U.S. sentiment has intensified, with crowds openly calling for retaliation against President Trump. Now, at the same time, attention is focused on who will succeed Khamenei, while signs are also emerging that Tehran may be looking to revive diplomacy and trade behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is pushing back against reports of tensions with Washington, insisting the two allies remain aligned on Iran. So where is this crisis heading, and what can we expect from the next round of U.S. Iran talks? For more on this, we are joined in the studio by Min Jung-hoon, professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. A very big welcome.
My pleasure always.
And also joining us online is Robert Lawrence, professor of English and Turkic Studies at Dongduk Women's University. Good to see you.
Great to see you too. Thank you for having me on.
So, Professor Lawrence, let's begin right away. Like I've said, Iran has begun state funeral ceremonies for former Supreme Leader Khamenei. What does this funeral mean for Iran politically and socially?
There's a great deal of messaging going on for both international and domestic audiences in these carefully orchestrated series of ceremonies. You know, whether that be the delegations coming from overseas on the first day, or the public farewell at the Grand Mosala in Tehran over the last couple days, or the procession through Tehran we saw earlier on today. You know, its significance for Iranian society truly depends on who you ask. You know, those who don't particularly care for the post-1979 Iranian government, given the late leader's proclivity for, to take heavy-handed approaches to domestic opposition, they likely don't have much sympathy for the martyrdom or victimhood narrative. They likely see this as a misuse of public funds that could be spent, to ease people's economic hardships, and they don't particularly care for being, having their businesses forced to be closed for the events. On the other hand, for the government and its supporters, this is an opportunity to publicly mourn. They're showing defiance, they're showing strength and continuity. They chose "We Must Rise" as the theme for the proceedings, and it's usually written alongside a picture of the late Supreme Leader's clenched fist. Additionally, we're seeing these red flags with messages that some of them explicitly ask for or call for revenge, and others are messages that evoke the death of the Prophet Muhammad's grandson, Hussein, who's a very important figure in Shia Islam. In fact, they erected a statue of the late leader's clenched fist, and they released a picture of his coffin draped in a red flag that said "Ya Hussein." This kind of elicits the idea of avenging an unjust killing because of historical events that happened in 680 AD in Karbala, where Imam Hussein was unjustly killed along with his family. So, the government is trying to project strength. It's showing that it's defiant and that there's continuity and unity within the government. But it's also trying to align the plight of the late Ayatollah Khamenei and the grandson of the Prophet, Hussein. This is kind of an appeal for pan-Shia support and solidarity. So there are a lot of cultural and religious symbolism. There's a lot of symbolism that's kind of carrying over to the political sphere.
So different opinions from various sides. Now, if we stay with the funeral, Professor Min, it also coincides with the 250th anniversary of the American independence. What do you make of the timing and the message from Iran?
Well, personally, I think that Iran could consider various things to schedule the state funeral. And it seems that one of the factors is that Iran wanted to utilize the funeral as a political event to mobilize the support of its people by emphasizing anti-Americanism. And I think that's why the funeral began on the 250th anniversary of American Independence Day. And it was reported by the media that Iranian people who came out to the funeral shouted the slogans like "Death to America," "Death to Israel," "Death to assassin," and interestingly, "Death to those who oppose the regime." So these slogans and atmosphere at the funeral suggest that Iranian government aims to elevate the Supreme Leader's death to that of a holy martyr who passed away to defend the country and try to inspire its people to fight against the United States and strengthen support for the regime. So personally, I think it seems that the funeral will contribute the Iranian people to maintaining their support for the government for some time, but I don't think that the effect will last long. That's mainly because Iranian people's support for their government will eventually depend on whether Iran could make a successful deal with the U.S. and get out of the economic hardship that they had to tolerate. So we'll see whether or not Iran would make a successful deal with the U.S. instead of delaying the ongoing negotiations.
Right, of course. The deal itself would be much more important. But when we go back to the funeral itself, Professor Lawrence, Iranian officials say up to 20 million people are expected to take part, with the procession planned to continue through Iraq before the burial on July 9th. Is this kind of mass funeral typical in Iran, or does it carry a broader meaning?
No, so this isn't a normal funeral at all. The scale is going to be difficult to interpret, I think, because objective data is going to be likely difficult to ascertain, and there are already reports indicating compulsory participation. The route itself, I think, is interesting and likely multidimensional in its objectives, right? Religiously, the cities of Qom, Najaf, Karbala, and Mashhad are all important to Shia Islam. Tomorrow there will be a funeral procession in Qom, which is a major center of learning for Shia Islam. But it's also home to the major seminaries that kind of compose the theological authority of the state. Next, they'll be flown to Najaf in Iraq, where there'll be a procession in both Najaf and Karbala. So Najaf is an important place in Shia Islam as well, because it's the resting place of Imam Ali. So you have the Imam Ali shrine there. He's the first Shia Imam in Twelver Shiism. He's also the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet Muhammad and the father of Hussein. So down the road a little bit, approximately 70 kilometers, I think, you also have Karbala, which is the next location. They'll have a procession there near the Imam Hussein shrine, and he's, like I said, the grandson of the Prophet and the third Shia Imam. So both of these shrines are some of the most important places in Shia Islam, and they're important pilgrimage sites as well. This is happening on the back end of Muharram as well. So Muharram is the first month in the Islamic calendar, but it's also when Shia Muslims, mourn the passing of Hussein for the first 10 days of the month. And this just finished up about a week and a half ago. So these two are combining in a very intentional way. Now, when he leaves Iraq, they'll go back to his hometown of Mashhad in northeastern Iran, where he'll be laid to rest at the Imam Reza shrine. And Imam Reza was the 8th Imam in Twelver Islam. So all of these, you're covering a lot of very important religious ground here, cultural ground, that can serve as a unifying force for the public as well. Politically, the trip to Iraq is a little bit more touchy. There's intense competition right now for influence in Iraq between the U.S. and Iran. And there are reports that some Iraqi officials are very hesitant to allow any events that carry implications beyond, the religious character, while others are welcoming, the deepening of ties between Iran and Iraq. So how the Iraqi leg of the trip proceeds, I think, is going to be watched pretty closely by everybody who observes the region.
So the scale and format of the funeral may also be sending a big political message as well. But Professor Min, reports actually say that U.S. President, the United States, has urged some countries not to send delegations to the funeral, of course, causing several to withdraw or hold their participation. Why is Washington taking these kinds of stands?
Well, I think that U.S. is going through a tough end of war negotiations with Iran nowadays. Although the two countries agreed to have 60 days for the negotiations, but it seems that it was not easy to make progress. For Washington, I think it was expected that along with the issue of opening the Strait of Hormuz, the two countries would talk about how to reduce Iran's nuclear capabilities and what corresponding measures U.S. Would offer during the negotiations. But they could not talk about the agenda so far, and instead they are still locked in a power struggle just over the issue of opening the Strait of Hormuz. So it shows that the two countries, U.S. and Iran, still try to increase their bargaining power in the early stage of the negotiations instead of making concessions to move forward for the deal. So, personally, I think Iran appears to believe that time is on its side, and it just sticks to its claims and tries to delay their negotiations. So such a situation shows why U.S. pushes the countries diplomatically not to attend their funeral. They are not ready to make concessions to move forward. Instead, they are just in the power struggle in the early stage of the negotiations. But I also think that Iran needed to realize that the war is fading away from U.S. voters' minds because the oil prices is falling in the United States, and the U.S. media are getting they pay more attention to their upcoming midterm elections and other domestic agendas. So it means that the Iran war is becoming a forgotten war to the U.S. voters' minds and the other people across the world. So Iran needs to ask itself, which country want to obtain from a deal more between the two, and is time still on Iran's side after oil prices are getting more stable. So otherwise, Iran would get in trouble because it can get out of the negotiation with empty hands.
So as you've mentioned, it's kind of a power struggle still going on, strong action from the U.S. And like we've touched upon, there's voices in Iran like saying death to America, also a very strong stance. How could the U.S. actually view this, and how concerned should we be about if further clashes, or possibly during the funeral period itself?
Well, personally, I think there's such a provocative slogans that could be uncomfortable to Washington, but it is unlikely that U.S. would have a surprise attack or the make further clashes during the funeral period because Washington want to maintain the negotiations. So if U.S. attacks and they would be victims on Iran's side during the period, it would be very difficult to continue to the negotiations. And recently, President Trump mentioned that during a media interview that he was watching the funeral, and one shot would take them all away at the funeral. But U.S. would not do that because U.S. would not have anyone to negotiate with after the strike. So I think it shows clearly that U.S. want to remain in the negotiations and manage the situation, although it could be uncomfortable with what is happening in Iran right now. So I expect that the negotiations will continue to go on, although Washington feels uncomfortable about what the Iranian people, government are talking about the United States and other things. But still, the U.S. want to maintain the negotiations.
Willingness to negotiate still stays. Now, turning to Iran's leadership then, another key question is whether Mojtaba Khamenei, widely seen as a possible successor, will appear at the funeral. Professor Lawrence, why has this attendance remained uncertain?
There's an abundance of speculation as to why he's not showing up. Some think that since we haven't really seen him since the beginning of Epic Fury, that he's no longer with us. Others think that he might be so severely injured that he's not able to make public appearances. A lot of it's pure speculation. We really don't know much. What we do know is 3 of his brothers showed up at the funeral alongside General Vahidi, who's head of the IRGC, Brigadier General Khani, who's head of the Quds Force, and then delegations from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis from Yemen. They all attended the first day's official ceremony. So, a lot of these people haven't really been out in public much in the last few months because of security risks. So a lot of people are asking, if they could show their face in public, then why can't Mojtaba Khamenei? You know, the answer to that question is probably known by a select small group of people. But one simple explanation is that he's explicitly been threatened by Israel. The Israeli defense minister, I think last week, Minister Katz said that he was marked for death, and then he kind of doubled down on that comment earlier on today and actually expanded the scope of the comment. You know, so assuming that he is healthy, you know, given the Israeli success in assassinating high-value targets since October 7th, I think it's logical to assume that the security threat plays a significant role in the decision for him not to come to the funeral so far.
Now, Professor Lawrence, if we look beyond the funeral, Iran is still facing economic hardship, public frustration, and an unresolved succession as well. How stable is the regime going forward?
Well, you know, this is kind of complicated due to the internet blackout and kind of the unreliability of polling data that comes out of Iran. You know, between economic failure over decades and what happened in January to protesters, there's certainly a considerable portion of the country that does not support the previous nor the current leadership of the country. Now, the size of that portion is heavily debated, and I would argue that it's based largely on speculation and incomplete data. So it's tough to really be certain. But, you know, within the ranks of the new leadership, there's been some jockeying for position, and I think a lot of people have blown this out of proportion. You know, Iran's always had competing factions within its upper tiers of government. But one thing they don't really argue much about is the primacy of regime security. And, you know, to put this into context, the Islamic Republic of Iran has a massive security apparatus, you know, upwards of 1 million people when you combine all forces. And when you factor in their decentralization strategy known as mosaic defense, you know, they have forces in all 31 provinces and then down to the county and down into the neighborhood level. These forces are designed to absorb strategic decapitation, to prolong war, and to suppress any domestic insurrection. So as we saw in January, you know, and in multiple protest movements over decades, the state is willing and able to do whatever it has to do to maintain regime security. So, you know, despite any presumed deficit in popularity that's difficult to quantify, I still think that destabilizing the current government is a pretty tall task. They're still very well armed. There are a lot of them, and basically the population isn't armed. And that's a very asymmetric reality there.
Right, and ultimately the bigger question will be what comes after the funeral. Now, if we turn to diplomacy, Professor Min, the New York Times reported that Israel considered targeting senior Iranian negotiators during ceasefire talks. Do you think this suggests there's some differences between the U.S. and Israel's stance over Iran?
Yes, and as you know, it was expected that Israel would be one of the main hurdles that U.S. needed to take control to make progress in the negotiations. And it was known that Israel perceived the war as a lifetime opportunity that it had dreamed of for decades. So with the help of U.S., more precisely with the help of President Trump, Israel tried to reduce the military capabilities of Iran and its friends like Hamas and Hezbollah. But unlike Israel's expectations, U.S. President Trump wanted to end the war, although Iran still keeps its nuclear and missile capabilities and imposes a security threat to Israel. So with the ground that Hezbollah is still an immediate security threat to the country, Israel has not taken the troops back from Lebanon and conducted military attacks again and again. And the same logic can be applied to the media report that Israel planned to kill the Iranian delegation that was negotiating with the U.S. So Washington may be uncomfortable with what Israel has been doing, but U.S. does not want to see a situation where U.S.-Israel relations would get worse because Israel is still an important and core ally in the Middle East. So it is likely that U.S. maintain a control over Israel in terms of the ongoing negotiations with Iran, and also tries to improve its overall relations with Israel or restore its relations with Israel and the upcoming summit between U.S. and Israel will be the event that will reaffirm the close relations between the two countries.
So that everyone's going to look closely into that. So follow-up negotiations are expected to resume after the funeral, with the Pakistani mediation playing a big role. Professor Lawrence, what will be the key issues there, and do you see any chance of a breakthrough?
Well, there's still major hurdles and pretty vast distances to bridge between the two sides. You know, despite the MOU, there seems to be a distinct deficit in understanding. You know, the two sides still differ on traffic through the Straits of Hormuz, the release of frozen assets and sanctions relief, the highly enriched uranium, support for regional proxies, Iran's nuclear program, and both sides are claiming that the other is violating the MOU, and they probably both have fairly good claims on that. So I think, like Dr. Min said earlier on, yeah, I think Iran's strategically trying to extend these negotiations. It believes that time is on its side. I'm not so sure that that's the truth right now, actually. But you know, either way, given the distrust between the two states, it's almost impossible to underestimate how much they distrust each other. So I hate to sound pessimistic, but I don't have a particularly optimistic view of what's about to happen next. I don't expect on the 11th that there'll be any major breakthroughs. And seeing what's happened so far, if there is a breakthrough, I have a feeling a week later they're going to be arguing about what that breakthrough was.
Well, it's always great to have various opinions on the show. So we will closely be watching to see whether diplomacy can finally gain some momentum moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Lawrence.
Thank you for having me on.
And of course, Professor Min, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.